Okay, well, I think we're probably about ready to get started. Those of you that don't know me already, my name is Katy Critchfield, and I am the tutoring specialist here at Literacy Pittsburgh. I was formerly North Hills program coordinator, and I've worked at Literacy Pittsburgh for coming up on 2 years now. There'll be lots of opportunities to ask questions as we move through the material today, but if you have any questions that you want to follow up by email about anything that we're talking about today, or any resource questions in general, my email is here on this first slide. It's specialist@literacypittsburgh.org. And I should say, you probably all know because you're here, but we're going to be talking about the TABE test today. So just give me a quick show of hands. You can either just like wave your hand or use the little icon here in Zoom. Who has a student who has been tested already using the TABE?
I do.
Paula does, Keith does. Gary, if this is the Gary I'm thinking of, you also do, maybe.
Yes.
Okay. And Susan, not yet, I think, right? But maybe soon. So this is a good opportunity to learn about the TABE test. And of the tutors here today, are we primarily looking at math tutors or tutors who are working with English language learners or tutors on reading skills as well? I know Susan is doing English, which will be kind of the reading TABE. I think, Keith, are you math? I'm not hearing you. I wonder if you're muted.
Reading and grammar.
Oh, great. Gary is math, I know.
Yes.
And Ala, are you also a math tutor or are you doing both?
No, actually English.
English, okay.
Reading, listening, conversations.
Great. Okay. So we will be covering both the math and the reading test as part of our conversation today. So let's get started. I am going to hopefully my slides are going to work here. Okay. As a little warm-up activity, I thought that it might be a good idea to try out some questions from some of the TABE tests. So we're going to look at just some of the questions from some of the easier levels of the TABE, and we're just going to do a few before we really kind of get stuck into the main part of our conversation today. So I'm going to show you a few questions. There are a few ways that you can answer these questions. If you have a cell phone with you, you can scan the QR code that you see on the screen right now. Just use your phone's camera to do that, and it's going to open up the quiz for you. If you don't want to do that, you can go to the website that's here on the screen, the slido.com, and you can put that code in to also join our quiz online. But if that feels like too much for today, you don't need to. What you can do is just type your answer in the chat. So I've gone ahead and joined it online. You can see my name has shown up there. I'll just give us a minute. So if anybody else wants to do that, they can do. There's Keith, great. And if you need help with figuring that out, you can just unmute yourself and ask, and I'm happy to answer questions and try to help you troubleshoot.
Katy, I can't see your screen, so I'm going to try coming in on my phone.
Okay. So. Is everybody else seeing my screen? It is, the screen share is working. Oh, great. Isiala is here.
It's kind of challenging using the phone for conferencing and going to the website.
It is challenging, I know. Well, this is only the very first part, so if it doesn't work out well, it's okay. Is anybody else still trying to get in, or should we move on to the questions? Susan's still trying. Okay, we'll just give it a minute. There we go. Okay. So I'll say if anybody has not been able to join the quiz live, you can just play along just for fun, or you can type your answers into the chat as well, because I don't want to spend too much time on this. So we're going to go in and have a look at some sample questions from a TABE test. So the first question comes from a language TABE, and it's asking you to identify the sentence that is written correctly in English. So if you're playing along on your phone, hopefully you see it there and you can choose your answer. If you don't, you can go ahead and just type it in the chat, or you can just play along for fun at home. And it is only going to give us 30 seconds, so then we'll have to move on. Okay, great. So everybody thought that it was answer 1. Everybody that answered. And yes, that is the correct answer. So we can take a look at a question from the math tape now. This one is asking us which pair of numbers has a greatest common factor of 32. Now this is testing whether you remember what those math terms mean if you're not teaching math. Oh, and it looks like it closed the voting for that one. I've opened it up again. This is where we see technology is never straightforward, is it? I like trying new things with technology, and then of course, sometimes it's not going to work out. Okay, somebody's answering in the chat. Great. And we're just a few more seconds left on this question. Okay, lots of people thought 64 and 96. And that is the correct answer. Okay, here's a question from the reading TABE, and this is from one of the lower levels of the reading TABE because it's asking a sort of phonics question. Which word has a short E vowel sound? And we're going to get into a little bit more where you might see this kind of question on the reading TABE. Okay, thanks for answering in the chat here as well. I am seeing those answers. Great. The answer was bed. Okay, here's a question from the language TABE. It's asking us to complete the gap in the sentence. So there's a funny story in today's newspaper, which is the correct version of today's, to fill the gap here. Okay, great. So yeah, the answer here was B. And the last one we're going to look at today is another math question. It's asking which attributes do all squares and rhombuses have in common? And this is multiple choice like the other ones, but there may be more than one correct answer here. So you can go ahead and select any that you think are correct. Pop them in the chat if you're not playing along online, or just do it at home for fun. Okay, so lots of people thought 4 sides of equal length and also 2 pairs of parallel sides. Those were the 2 answers. Okay, great. So congratulations, everybody. Thanks for playing along. I'll tell you, that was the first time I've done that. So maybe it didn't go completely smoothly, but I think it's always fun to try new things. And I thought it would be a fun way to just warm up for today's talk, because it's a little bit dry, some of the material we're going to be covering. But we'll move away from that now to talk about what our conversation today is about. So we will talk first about the TABE test in general terms. I'm going to share some information about who we give the TABE test to here at Literacy Pittsburgh. We'll talk about what it actually looks like for our students when they're taking the TABE test. And I'm going to share some information about the different levels of the TABE. that we use with our students. Then, as I mentioned at the beginning, at Literacy Pittsburgh, most of our students are assessed using either the reading or the math TABE tests. And I think that's true for all of you as well. So we're going to take a deeper dive into both of those tests. I'm going to share a little bit more about what kind of materials are on the test in both cases. We'll have a look at some TABE test scores and figure out what those mean. The chances are you've heard a TABE test score. Somebody will tell you this was your student's score, but maybe you don't really understand what that means. So we'll dig a little bit deeper into that. And then to finish up, we'll think about some ways that you can help your student be as well prepared for testing using the TABE as possible. So what is the TABE? It stands for Test of Adult Basic Education. It's a test that is nationally recognized, and it's used explicitly and uniquely rather in adult education. It's designed to assess skills in reading, math, and language. At Literacy Pittsburgh, if you've been tutoring for a while, you already know that we test our students fairly regularly. All students are given a test when they join our program, and then we test students on average after around 50 hours of educational contact time. We're also trying to get tests from our students at least twice in every program year, so that every year students will have both a pre-test and a post-test on file for us. And there's lots of reasons why we are testing our students so frequently. First of all, it helps us to find the right learning materials for students, so we're able to give them textbooks and other materials that are at an appropriate level for them. And it also helps us to figure out what our students already know, what are their areas of strengths, and what things they may need to focus on in order to progress to the next level. Test scores are helpful when we're thinking about placing students, especially if they're going to be placed in a group or a class. And they help us to assess our learners' progress over time in a more objective way. On a more practical level, they also do enable us to fulfill our grant funding requirements from the state, and they help us show that our program is effective when we're talking to donors, to possible donors. So tests are really important to us for all those reasons and for some other reasons that we haven't covered today. But the TABE is just one of the tests that we use with our students at Literacy Pittsburgh. So I wanted to talk very briefly about who gets the TABE test and how we decide to give a TABE test to a student. So there are two main groups of students that are given a TABE test. First of all students who are working on a reading or a math goal get the TABE test. A lot of those students, but not all of them, will be American-born students. And then we also use the TABE test with English language learners who are working at an advanced level, who have tested out of our speaking and listening test. And those language learners usually also have either a professional goal or a goal of entering post-secondary education. So if you have a student who is currently being assessed with the TABE, they are likely to fall into one of those two groups. In Pennsylvania, the Department of Education has approved 3 types of TABE test for adult education programs like ours at Literacy Pittsburgh. And those are the reading TABE, the math TABE, and the language TABE. The reading one is the most common one in our program. So almost all of our TABE tested students take this test, whether those are adult basic education students or advanced English language learners. We don't give the math test to English language learners unless they are working toward a specific goal that requires math. But all students who are working toward a high school equivalency diploma, or who want to work on math skills for other reasons, maybe because they want to join a trade school or they want to study at a post-secondary education institution, will also take the math test. And the language test is used pretty rarely at Literacy Pittsburgh. We will use it occasionally with very advanced English language learning students. Often if they've already moved through all of the levels of the reading test and we're looking for other ways to assess their skills, then the language test can be useful for us for those reasons. So we talked a little bit about the different types of TABE tests, the reading, the math, and the language test, but each of those types also has multiple possible testing levels, and this is where it gets a little bit complicated. So students are assigned a different testing level depending on if they're new students and they've never taken a TABE test before. We'll give them a locator test that places them in the correct level of TABE test. And if they've already taken a TABE test with us, we look at their previous score and we find the right level for them to take the test next time. Different levels of the TABE test assess different skills. And different levels can also generate different score ranges. So I'm showing this on this graphic here, which I hope you can see. The kind of most basic or foundational level is called literacy level, or L, and it's measuring skills at what we call educational functional levels 1 and 2. If we move up a level to the E, that test can measure skills at educational functional levels 1 through 3. So it's measuring skills that go a little bit higher on our levels assessment scale. If we go up to level M, we're looking at skills at levels 2 through 4. Level D is measuring skills at levels 3 through 5. And level A is the most advanced level, and that's measuring skills at levels 4 through 6. And you'll notice that those levels overlap. And that means that students can progress between levels as they're building and growing their skills. So what we might see is a student might join our program and they take the test at level E. But maybe they're scoring at a level 3 when they take that test. So next time we wouldn't want to give them the level E again because there's nowhere to go. They hit the ceiling on that level. So next time we might give them the level M, which would give them the opportunity to progress potentially to a level 4. That's probably the most complicated thing we're going to talk about today. So does anybody have any questions? I'll pause real quick and see if anybody wants me to go into any more detail about the information on this slide. We're good. What I will just say quickly is that the educational functional level is a specific scale that measures adult skills and competencies. So rather than giving adults a level that's based on like a grade level equivalency that would align to the K through 12 educational system, this is a specific scale that measures the skills of adult learners. And there are 6 possible levels. You see here it goes from level 1 through 6. And you may have seen that level shared with you if you have a student who's currently being tested with a TABE test. Okay, we'll talk a little bit about the logistics of TABE testing. So I mentioned the levels and how do we know which level a student is going to take the test. So what we do first of all is we give all of our students a locator test, and that helps us to place the student in the correct level for their testing. The locator test for reading is quite long. It's 35 minutes. And then for the language and math test, it's a 20-minute locator test. And students test usually either on a computer or an iPad. In rare cases, we can give students a paper-based test if it's not feasible for them to test using technology for whatever reason. But the vast majority of our students test in a technology system. Students can test in person, either at our downtown center or meeting their coordinator in their local area. But the nice thing about the TABE is that students can also test remotely. So if they have the right technology set up at home, they can take this test. They log into a Zoom meeting with us and they can take the test remotely. So students like it for that reason, because it means they don't have to travel anywhere if that's not something that's going to be feasible for them. Once they've done the locator test, then they actually do the test proper, and you'll see from these testing times that it is a long test. And this is the thing that students don't like about it. So they like the flexibility of remote testing, but the length of the test is sometimes a sticking point for students. So the reading test has got 2 parts that are 50 minutes each. So the whole test takes 1 hour and 40 minutes. And that's assuming that they're not taking a break, which most people do need a break in the middle of that long test. And the math test is 65 minutes. The 65 minutes is broken apart slightly differently depending on which level of test the students are taking, but it's always the same testing time in the end. So any questions about the logistics of the TABE test, what it actually might look like for your students, or anything else that we've talked about in the last couple of minutes? Yeah, Susan, go ahead.
Yeah, so what kind of interval do you need between the locator and the actual taking the test?
Great question. So students actually do that on the same day. So it is a really long testing session. So they would show up, they would do the locator test first of all, and then the test automatically tells us which test to put them in, and they usually would just do the whole thing. There is the opportunity to take breaks in between the locator and then in between parts 1 and 2. And if students ever need to pause the test just to take a break as well, they can always do that as well. Okay, I see another question. Somebody has their hand raised. Go ahead. I'm not sure what name you have there. I think you're muted.
Thank you. This is Adrian.
Hi,
That's my
Adrian.
company name. Sorry about that.
It's
I wanted
okay.
to ask you, just whenever someone logs in, which I see that you have to have like a pre-login to be able to have an account to be able to get in there. Once you get in there and you take your test, are you able to go backwards, pause, come back to it? Like if something happens and you're at home, does it have that flexibility where it can like reboot if you have to leave it and come back? You know what I mean?
Yeah, it is possible. Sometimes students do have to like leave before the test is completed or whatever. And it is possible to go back into the test at that point as well. So you can pause it. And I think it gives you up to 20 minutes if you just need to step away for a brief period of time. Or you can also, walk away and then rejoin the test at a later date. It works best if students have at least completed one part of the test rather than leaving completely in the middle. I think it's possible that you might lose your progress under those circumstances. But the test does have to be proctored. So students can't just take it at any point at home. They do, even if they're doing it remotely, they have to log into Zoom and they have to have a Literacy Pittsburgh person monitoring them during the course of their testing and making sure that they're complying with all of the testing rules. That's a good question. I hadn't thought to say that before.
Okay, thank you so much.
You're welcome. Susan, go ahead.
Thanks. So are you going to get into scoring? I'm curious if it's like if you get one wrong, if it detracts from your score, if it's just a straight, but I can wait for the answer if you're going to get into that.
Yeah, I will say just very quickly that no, there's no penalty for guessing. So getting a question wrong is not a problem. But yeah, we will talk a little bit more about scoring and some tips that you can share with your student as well if they're wanting to think about test taking strategy. Adrian, your hand is still raised. Is that just from before?
Yep, I'm gonna pull it down. Sorry.
Okay, great. All right, well, let's keep moving, and there will be more time for questions, and you can feel free to jump in and interrupt me as well. So we will now move to thinking about the reading TABE test in a little bit more detail. So there are 4 main areas, or they call them domains, on the TABE test publisher, that they're measuring the skills in these 4 areas on the reading test. Phonics and word recognition is measured only in the basics levels L and E. So in those more foundational levels, those skills are being assessed. At the higher levels, M, D, and A, they're measuring only these other 3 skills: key ideas and details, craft and structure, and integration of knowledge and ideas. So it's really specific reading comprehension skills that are being assessed in these tests. The kind of reading passages that the student is going to be presented with also changes depending on the level of the test. So at the lower levels, students are only going to be reading informational texts and fiction texts. And as you go through to the higher levels, students are going to be encountering texts from a much broader range of disciplines, and the texts that they'll be reading are much more rigorous and challenging as well. So we're going to kind of get into that a little bit more, but I just wanted to share that kind of overview that the TABE really does vary level by level. And one thing I will say that sometimes happens with our students is they may take the TABE at a certain level, maybe they're testing at level M, and they've scored high enough that we would move them to the next level for their next test. And then sometimes their score actually drops. And the reason for that is because the skills that are being assessed are just that much harder, and it's maybe material that they haven't yet covered. So we don't worry when that happens. You know, overall, we want our students to be progressing and increasing their score, but sometimes moving between levels can actually cause the score to drop. Okay, we're just going to have a kind of a little bit of a closer look at what's being measured on some of the different levels of the TABE. So this little chart here comes from the TABE test website, and it shows the skills that are being measured at the literacy level, which is the most basic level of the test. Not a lot of our students are given this test, but you'll see that almost 50% of the skills that are being measured are alphabetic skills. So we're talking about phonological awareness and phonics and word recognition. And the remaining 50% of the test at the literacy level is measuring those kind of general reading comprehension skills. So key ideas and details, craft and structure, and just a small percentage is looking at the integration of knowledge and ideas. Once we move up to the next level, which is level E, there's still a little bit of phonics and word recognition, just 16%, but at this level, all 4 skills are being assessed. And then this chart comes from the level D test, but it's very similar to the chart for level M and level A. And at these higher levels, just the 3 reading comprehension skills are being assessed. So is the student able to work with key ideas and details? Are they able to look at craft and structure and answer questions based on that? And are they able to integrate knowledge and ideas when they're talking about the text? Okay, this little graphic comes from a training given by the Institute for the Professional Development of Adult Educators, and it was a webinar called Breaking Down the TABE 11 and 12 Reading Test. I like this a lot because it shows what kinds of texts are being presented to the student at the various levels. So they start with level E here. At level E, students are being assessed on foundational skills, and they will be given only informational texts. Once we move up to level M, students are being given informational texts and literary texts. And then once we move up to the higher levels D and A, students will still get informational and literary texts, but they will also be expected to read history and social studies texts and science and technical texts. So it's a really big range, and that can be challenging for our students who maybe are not used to reading texts from all kinds of disciplines. I just see that there's something in the chat I'm going to see. Okay. Does anybody have any questions about the kind of material that's on the reading test? Because what we're going to move to next is actually some sample questions. But before we do that, I wanted to see if anybody has any questions about those slides that we've just been looking at together. Okay. All right, so I pulled some sample questions for TABE tests at 2 different levels in the reading side of the program. The first is level M, and this is probably the most common level that our students are taking the test at. So the chances are they'll be looking at texts that are similar to this. The way the test is set up in the reading side of the program is that students will read a text and then they will answer several questions on that one text. So they're not just having like one text, one question, one text, one question. They have to read the text in close detail and then be ready to answer several questions about that text. This is only part of the actual text. So this might seem long, but they actually have to read an even longer text than this, even at this level M. But you'll see that at this level, the paragraphs are not too long. The sentences also are not too long or too complex. And the vocabulary, I mean, there's some pretty specific vocabulary like the pontoon boat, or we're talking about the whales migrating, but the vocabulary is not too difficult at this level. And let's have a look at the kind of questions that students might be asked. So at this level, there are more kind of critical thinking and conceptual higher level questions, but students will also be asked questions that are just more straightforward comprehension questions. So this question, what type of whale can be seen by whale watchers? And the answer is straightforward. It's in the text right here. It's the gray whales. So they don't have to do any kind of analysis of the text. They just have to be able to have read and understood it in order to answer that question. The same with this one here. Why do whales swim near whale watching boats for hours? Again, if we look back at the text here, it just says here, interestingly, some whales are just as curious about humans as humans are about them. They may swim near a boat for hours watching the passengers. So we can figure out that the answer here is that they are very interested in humans. So again, there's not really the need to kind of go into any deep reading comprehension skills like making inferences and so on. But let's look in contrast at the TABE test for level A, which is the most advanced level of the test. Right away, you can see that the paragraphs are longer, the sentences are longer. It's a more complicated text, although this is also just another informational text, I think. And the questions are also more complicated. So the first question here is asking for the student to identify the key idea that's supported by this sentence. So really they're kind of having to pull some more information from the text and figure out, using their critical thinking skills to answer that question. And then again, question 2 asks which is most likely the author's purpose for writing this article. So again, they have to be able to think about the text, like why is the author writing this? What's the reason for the text? And do that kind of deeper level analysis on the text. So that's just a few sample questions. Once we get toward the end of this presentation, I'm going to share a resource where you can find more sample questions. If you want to see a TABE test in more detail, you can. So we're not allowed to share actual TABE questions, but there's a TABE test website where you can see official sample questions. And I think you'll probably find that useful if you're working on TABE skills with your learner. But does anybody have any questions about the reading TABE before we move on to talking about the math TABE? Oh, Susan, go ahead.
So on this one, like, do they have access to the text when they're answering the question, or they're expected to read and remember and then go and answer the question?
Great question. So when they're working online, the text is set up so that they have the test is set up so that they have the text on one side and the question on the other, so they can be referring back and forth. If we have time today, I can show you the online testing site. We'll see if we can get to that. But if we don't have time, I can share a link to that so you can see what the questions look like on the online testing site. And some of you may want to share that with your students as well. Sometimes students want to do a lot of sort of preparation and be really ready for a test, and some students don't. I think it's just sort of a personality type difference, and either option can work well. But I will share resources with you once we get to the end of our presentation today. If I miss you, by the way, if anybody's waving at me to ask a question, I can't see everybody because I'm sharing my screen. So you can feel free to pop stuff in the chat or raise the hand in the app, or just unmute yourself as well. And I apologize if you have been waving at me and I've been missing you. Okay, so let's have a look at the math test. Reading was really nice to say because it just had these 4 skills that were being assessed. Math has a lot of skills. So this is just like a partial list of the skills that are being assessed in the math test. I'm actually going to move quite quickly to the next slide because I think this is more useful. So this shows the skills that are being assessed at the different TABE levels. So you'll see that at level L, which is the easiest level of the TABE, students are just being assessed on 4 foundational skills. So measurement and data, number and operations in base 10, operations and algebraic thinking, and geometry. When students move up to level E, then we add in fractions, but otherwise it's the same. But then once they get to level M, you'll see that there's a whole load of skills that are being assessed here. So all of these foundational skills are being assessed, but then there's also a big range of intermediate level skills that are being added in. And you can see that it's probably a big jump, right? Going from level E to level M, the kind of questions and the kinds of things they're going to be asked is suddenly a lot more. Level D removes the foundational skills. So those are no longer being assessed, and it adds in one more kind of higher level skill. And then level A has removed all the foundational skills and most of the intermediate skills and is just mostly assessing these higher level skills. And interestingly, geometry remains all the way through. I'm not really sure why. I don't know how they designed the test or who decided what was in there. But so you'll see there's a big range of content area that's being covered in the math TABE. So I have a few sample questions to look at. And again, you know, you can't really get a picture of the whole TABE from these samples, but I thought it was interesting just to do a little bit of a compare and contrast between the different levels. So, oops, sorry about that. I pulled some questions from level E. So this one is asking learners to find the area of this figure. And you'll see that that's going to have to be a 2-part answer, right? Students are going to have to split this shape into 2 different rectangles and figure out the length and the width of each rectangle. They'll have to know how to find area based on length and width, and then they'll have to add those 2 areas together. So even at level E, which is just above the literacy level, there's lots of steps there involved in that question, but you don't necessarily need a whole lot of specialized math knowledge in order to be able to answer it. Here's another sample question from level E. You'll see this is a word problem. If you're working with students on math, you know that word problems feature large. So it's important that students know how to solve word problems. Again, this is a multi-step problem, right? So it's telling us Tiffany works at a nail salon. In the first week, she had 38 clients. In the second week, she had 12 on Monday, 11 on Tuesday, and 9 on Wednesday. How many fewer clients? So again, students are going to have to do those 2 steps. They're going to have to figure out how many clients there were in total in that second week, and what's the difference between the clients in the first week and the second week. But if we have a look at some sample questions from level D, which is the second highest level, we'll see that the questions, this is somewhat different. You know, it relies on students knowing what a scatter plot is, knowing how to read a graph like this, and then knowing the background math, you know, what kind of pattern is displayed with this. And then again, still somewhat complex at this level. So we're having to simplify some expressions and figure out which 3 of these expressions are equivalent to the simplified version of 10x plus 11. So that might be harder if you're not a mathematician. Okay, any questions about the math TABE? All right, so let's have a think about test scores now. The chances are, if you have a student who has been assessed with the TABE, you will have been told their scale score, and you may have been told their level as well. You probably have not been told a whole lot more than that. When a student has taken a test, a TABE test, we can get this basic report about them from DRC, which is the company that publishes the TABE test. So we would be able to download this report that tells us the date the student was tested, the test they took, and the level of the test that they took. The scale score, we would tell the tutors, and you know, that can be helpful if you know a previous test score. Then you can just see a straightforward, did the student's score go up or down? And that definitely tells you something about the progress that they're making. The level is also important when you're thinking about, you know, has your student made progress? Are they making gains and moving up through the levels? And for many tutors, especially if you're working with an English language learner who is taking a reading TABE, that might be enough information. But if you are working with a learner, especially who maybe has a high school equivalency goal or who's working toward passing a specific test, you might like to ask your program coordinator for a little bit more information. One of the things that you can get is specific information about how your learner has performed on the different areas that are being measured by the test. So this student took the math test at level A, so they were being measured on these domains. And what we can see from this report about the student is that they had non-proficiency in numbers and quantity. So they're going to need to work more on that area. They showed partial proficiency in algebra, statistics and probability, and geometry, and they showed proficiency in functions. So that's already a little bit more helpful information about this student's specific performance. But if you wanted even more, you can actually get even more information if you asked your coordinator for the student's TABE profile. They would be able to share this information with you. And this digs even deeper into the domain being assessed. So in geometry, we know already that this student had partial proficiency, but it goes on to show which skills the student already demonstrated, and it suggests which areas you might want to focus on next with your student. And those areas are designed to help your student progress in the TABE test. So they're not necessarily going to be the areas that you would want to focus on. If your student's goal is not explicitly tied to a TABE test score, then that may be slightly less helpful for you. But even so, it is good information. It's available. So if it's something that you want, you can talk to your program coordinator about getting a copy of that for your student. And we talked a little bit earlier about the NRS levels that we use in adult education. That's the specific kind of scored leveling scores that we give to our adult education students rather than grade level equivalencies. But there are some situations where it might be helpful for you to know a grade level equivalency. Maybe you are working with a student on reading skills and you're looking to bring in some extra articles to read together with your student. And sometimes if you're working on a site like ReadWorks or Common Lit, you might find that those articles are leveled by grade level. And so, but you don't know where to start, right? But if your student, for example, had a recent TABE test and they were coming out at a level 3, you would know that you could look for articles at a grade level of 4th or 5th grade, and that's likely to be around the right level for your student. You can break it down even more and say if your student had a test score between 501 and 518 on the TABE reading test, then they're likely to be working at around a 4th grade level. Or if they scored between 519 and 535, they're likely to be working at around a 5th grade level. And you all already know this, I'm sure, but we don't share those grade level equivalencies with our students because they are adult learners. They're not 4th or 5th graders, but sometimes it is helpful just to know what material you're looking for so that you can find things that are going to be at the right level for your learner. Those charts I can share with you if that would be helpful for you. And it looks almost the same with math. The NRS levels map onto the same grade level equivalencies, but the scale score range is ever so slightly different. So if you're working with a math student, it would be a slightly different chart that you would need to look at to find that explicit grade level equivalency. So questions about the test scores before we move on to thinking about how to help your students prepare. Okay. First of all, I do want to say that the publishers of the TABE test explicitly say that students should not prepare for the TABE test, or should not study for the TABE test, I should say, because the test is designed not to assess content knowledge, but designed to assess skills. So it's not the kind of test that you can kind of cram for and like amass as much content knowledge as possible in order to do well on the test. That said, there are some things that we can do to help our learners make progress on the TABE. The number one thing that you can do to help your student be well prepared is to use the curriculum that Literacy Pittsburgh provides. All of the curricula that we use with our students are aligned to the standards of adult education, and those are the standards that are being assessed in the TABE test. So if you're using that material, the chances are that your student is going to be learning the skills that they need to succeed in the TABE test. Our curricula are also designed to help students kind of scaffold their skills, so to build skills and grow what they already know. So the chances are, like I say, if you're using those materials, in the end, your student will most likely improve their scores on the TABE test. However, I do have two key tips that I think are really helpful in thinking about both the reading and the math TABE. For the reading TABE, you will have noticed, or you will notice if you get the opportunity to look at the sample questions in more detail, that the texts that the students are being asked to read are really long. It's not just like a paragraph or a couple of paragraphs. It's like a lot of content that they're being asked to engage with. So one of the key ways that you can help them prepare for that test is to help them build their reading stamina by giving them access to longer articles and giving them the opportunity to practice reading in that way. We know that reading every day is one of the key things that our learners can do to help them build their reading skills. Like a little bit every day really goes a long way. And the other thing that you can do for students working on the reading TABE is to give them exposure to articles and texts that are across multiple different disciplines, because as you saw, they're going to be reading articles from many different sources when they're taking the TABE test. So building the stamina and giving access to lots of different source material. If you have a learner who is working with the math TABE test, then you saw that there's so much content that's being assessed here. So I think the best way to help them prepare for that test is to make sure that they're working across a range of skill areas and give them regular opportunities to review previous skills that you've been working on together. So, it's tempting sometimes to have a learner master a skill and then you move on to something new and you assume that that's taken care of. But if students have the opportunity to cycle back and review those previous materials, that's going to help them to kind of keep those continuously top of their mind and be effective with using and practicing those skills. My slides are not advancing. Okay. The other thing that you can do to help your learner is think about some test taking skills. And this is something that's going to help them not just with the TABE, but with other tests that they may need to take in the future, whether while they're students at Literacy Pittsburgh or at any point in their life. So there's lots and lots of test taking skills that you can find. If you look it up online, that's always a good resource. But these are the three that I think are most important, especially related to the TABE. So the first one is time management. And we talked a little bit about that when we were thinking about what it's going to look like in the online platform. It's a great idea to recommend that your student answers questions they know they can do first, rather than spending a lot of time on questions that they are really not sure about. So in the TABE testing site, students have the opportunity to flag a question that they might want to return to later. So they can prioritize their time, answer things that they know they can do, and then come back to those more difficult ones later. And that's something that you can help them strategize and think about as they're preparing for their test. The second tip I have is make sure that your student is doing a good job at close reading the questions. That's true of both math and reading. It's important that the student knows what is being asked of them before they jump in and give their answer. And then the last tip I have is to help your learner think about maximizing their probability. So Susan, you asked whether there was a penalty for getting an answer incorrect. There is not. So even if a student has no idea what the answer is, it's a good idea just to take a guess. But one way that they can make their chances better if they are just guessing is they can rule out any answers they know are incorrect. And on the TABE test, there is a little tool for crossing out answers. So if they know that one or two answers is definitely not the right answer, they can just cross that out, and then they have a greater probability of guessing the correct answer. And hopefully they're not guessing on too many, but it's a multiple choice test. So that is a valid test taking strategy, I think. Okay, we'll have a look at some resources. So I'm actually going to, let's see if I click on this. Are you seeing with me as I've shared my screen, or do I need to, are you still in my presentation? I'm going to stop the share and go back into a new share. So the first resource that I wanted to share with you today is the TABE test website. This is just a publicly available website, so any of you can go to this website. There is a lot on here, so you probably don't want to spend too much time on here. I've already done the work and kind of dug into the content and pulled out the things that I think are most useful, and that's what we've been talking about today. But the one thing that you may want to look at on here is the sample TABE tests. So you would just go to tabetest.com, you would look under resources, TABE 11 and 12, practice items, blueprints, testing times, and then practice items. That was a lot of steps, but it's pretty straightforward once you get onto the website. And then you will see that they have sample items for the tests at the different levels. They don't have the literacy level, but the chances are your learners are not going to be taking the test at the literacy level. If they are and you need support with that, you can reach out to me and we can talk one-on-one. So if you're not sure what level of test your student is taking, you can reach out to your coordinator, or you can just look at the sample items at multiple different levels. The majority of our students are tested on either level M or D. So that's it's worth looking at that. I'll just show you what one looks like very quickly. So I've clicked on reading D. And it's going to pull up the text here. So you'll see how long it is. It's still going. And then there's a bunch of questions here that are all based on that text. And it gives you the answers as well. So if you're not sure about the answer, that's helpful. The second resource I'm sharing in my slide is the online tools training. And this is something that we do share with our students ahead of them taking a test so that they can prepare using the online platform. But again, this is just publicly available. Anyone can go to this. And it gives you a preview of what the actual test online looks like. So I will just quickly show you the math test. And the sample questions that are on here are the same ones that are on that website. So you're not going to get access to any more sample questions going in this way, but you can see what the testing site looks like. So it just gives you a little, I'm just clicking through this real quick because we don't have a lot of time. It gives you the kind of background information, but then once you're in the test, you'll see how it looks. So it's multiple choice. Students are going to select the answer that they think is correct. And then they'll go to the next question. In the math test, sometimes there's the option to use a calculator. So that's something to make sure that your student knows about. And there is also a formula sheet, a reference sheet. So for example, when we saw that question about finding the area of the rectangle, look, it's actually in here. So if you forgot how to find the area of a rectangle, you can check the formula sheet and you'll see that it's right here. And the other thing we talked about is the flag option. So if you didn't know the answer to this question and you wanted to move on and not waste your time, you could flag it, and then it will show up later that you need to come back and look at that question. We talked about the crossing out option as well. If you know this one's not right and you know this one's not right, you can cross those out, and then you can take time to consider which answer you think might be the correct answer. Once you get to the end of the test, you'll see that any questions that you flagged for review are noted here, and you can return to them and try to choose an answer. So you don't have to look at that with your student, but if you wanted to explore it yourself, it's potentially a good option. So I'm just going to go back into my slideshow. So those resources are here, but I'm going to go ahead and say I will send those to anybody who came today if you're wanting to look at those in more detail. Oh, I don't think I've shared my screen again, have I? No, I just opened it on my side. Okay. So any final questions before we wrap up?
Will we be able to see then, like the test that when the student that I have will be taking tomorrow will be able to see, or Friday, I guess, will be able to see all the details of that test level and so forth?
Yes, so it's something that you would have to request, Gary. So a standard, we don't send that just because it's like a little overwhelming, like the amount of content and information on there is a lot. And we don't necessarily expect our tutors to engage with all of that. We are looking at it, and when we're thinking about, you know, materials and so on for your learner, we definitely want that information. But if you want it, you can let Miranda know or let me know, and it is information that we can share. Yeah, absolutely.
Would you advise the student to try to look at these sites to get a better idea of the test coming at the last minute, or is it like too late?
Yeah, I mean, if you're meeting with him, you could look at it, but it's okay if he doesn't. I mean, like I say, the test is designed to be, you know, the students can show up and it's assessing the skills that they have. So, and the other thing to say is that we will take time at the beginning of the testing session to show the testing site to the student as well. So we're not just throwing them into it. We would show them how to work it and make sure they know how to use those features like the calculator, the function sheet, how to cross out answers. So that's going to be covered with your student. It's just that some students like to have the opportunity to do that in a bit more detail. So it's good to know that it's there. Adrian, I'm going to go ahead to you, and then Susan, I see you have your hand raised as well.
Sure. Just a quick question. If I understood correctly, we as tutors, we can request the history, or we could say we could request how the test outcomes are. Are we able to go back and see the progression? Like, my question is, can my coordinator go back through some history like a year ago or 2 years ago?
Yeah, we have access to all of the old reports for the students. So we could get test scores, and we could get more information as well about like areas of proficiency specifically.
Great, thank you.
Yeah. Susan, you had a question too?
I did, but it's just slipped my mind.
Oh,
so
no, sorry. If you come back to it, we can come back to you. Okay, well, we are hitting about 3 o'clock. Oh, Susan, go ahead, and then we'll wrap up.
So you showed us the sample questions that aren't real questions. Does the site allow you to download that?
Yes, I think so. It's a PDF, and I think you could probably print it or download it as well. And it is a small sample, I will say. Like the TABE test is really long. There's lots of questions. There's lots of different text types. It's not showing you a whole lot, but it's better than nothing. And it's showing you the kind of level of question that the student is likely to be asked as well, which I think is really helpful. Okay, well, we covered a lot of information today. I hope I haven't left your heads reeling too much. Do feel free to follow up with me if any of the resources from today's presentation seemed like they would be helpful for you and your learner. If you have any follow-up questions, if anything occurs to you after the fact, I'm really happy to have more conversations with any tutors about any of this information. I hope it was helpful in thinking a little bit about what the TABE test is and what it means when you get that number to say what happened with your student. And you know, some ideas on how to help your student perform effectively on the TABE test as well. All right, well, we are all done. Like I say, I'm here to help with questions at any point, but that's it for today. We're ready to wrap up. Thank you so much for attending, for taking time out of your afternoon on a Wednesday. It was great to see everybody.
Thank you,
Thank you,
Katie.
Katie.
Very helpful.
Thank you.
Thank you.